You rolling?
Yeah.
Cool. Night school.
Night school.
So, last time we were talking about this book, we left off. I left like an open question because we were talking about the 5 or 6 different categories of morality.
Oh, right.
That-
Yeah.
Here's what. So you remember I said 5 and then it was 6 or vice
Yeah.
versa.
Yeah.
So I was reviewing the book today, and it uses 5 and 6 at different parts of the book, and I don't know why. So
Is there one that gets cut, or
Yeah,
is it a totally different thing?
liberty and oppression
Huh.
is the one that is brought up sometimes and sometimes not. So I think it's not a part of the core 5. I think it falls within loyalty and betrayal, and and it comes up specifically in the political conversation. So anyway, it's 5 base ones, but we're talking about those 5 base categories of morality and how there's a conversation about whether they're learned or innate. I mean, learned in this lifetime or learned before this one and then inherited.
Right.
And you brought up the question about whether it's possible that the Care and Harm Foundation, which is the most fundamental, was innate and the rest were learned. And I said, not according to Jonathan Haidt, but I don't know why. And I'll answer it in the next episode. And then I also said, Jonathan Haidt said that some evolutionary psychologists or evolutionary anythingists sometimes just take a trait that people have and then just make up a post hoc story for why that trait was evolved, and that his approach was different, but I didn't understand yet what was different about it. So I can address the second question first. Actually, I got to read something out of here, page 149.
Cool.
In psychology, theories are cheap. Anyone can invent one. Progress happens when theories are tested, supported, and corrected by empirical evidence, especially when a theory proves to be useful. For example, if it helps people to understand why half of the people in their country seem to live in a different moral universe. So that's the difference. He was just saying that some evolutionary whateverists will get ideologically attached to stories that they made up as to why traits were developed, and never actually test the hypothesis through a sound scientific process. So that's the difference there. Before I get into the evolutionary foundations for the 5 categories of morality that Haidt identifies, I'm really excited to tell you about his emphasis on group evolution, because he says that a lot of evolutionary psychologists leave group evolution out of the story and assume that individuals evolve in competition with one another, but that groups of individuals do not evolve in competition with one another as group versus group. He goes back to a very fundamental, I mean, as far back as we can look, or as small as we can look in terms of evolution, and describes how molecules forming atoms, or maybe it's the other way around, I don't even remember.
Atoms form molecules, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Atoms forming molecules, how they existed among each other, but then when some started to bond, they easily dominated the space and started getting other atoms to attach to them, and then those molecules started competing with each other. And so he goes way back in the story. I'm not familiar enough with that material to easily grasp and present it, so that's why you got to read the book instead of just listen to me talk about it. But then he describes how individuals were originally competing with each other until they gained enough sameness with other individuals that they were then a group that could just start dominating the landscape.
Okay.
And then as multiple groups started to form and they competed with each other, you have the origin of moral systems that bond people to each other. And he uses that evolutionary knowledge as the foundation for his story about how liberals and conservatives and different religious groups are opposed to each other. So something really interesting he said about group evolution is, and there's another social scientist who expresses this theory. I can't remember his name, unfortunately. He says that human beings are like 90% chimp and 10% bee. So,
Okay.
So bees operate on a group consciousness. One bee doesn't just have its own ideas and its own agenda.
Right.
Every single bee serves the hive.
Yeah.
Chimps are fighting with each other all the time. So when chimps arrange themselves into a dominance hierarchy, it's individual versus individual all the way. One rises to the top. As long as they're not too big of a dick, the other chimps let that homie hang out at the top. Until he becomes too big of a dick, they overthrow him.
Or till it gets too
So,
old.
Yeah, or
Yep.
until he gets too old and weak and someone young takes over. So
Yep.
chimps are very, very individualistic and autonomous.
Yeah.
And the group dynamic arises when they overthrow a leader, but not regularly. Like they don't have a good sense of tribalism. Bees don't have any individuality or autonomy.
Right.
An individual bee. Jordan Peterson said, "What the hell are you going to do with 6 bees?" You know, that's how bees function. They're a cell
Yeah.
in an organism, and that's their whole consciousness.
Yeah.
Human beings have the ability to operate at a group consciousness level and an individual consciousness level. And Haidt describes, citing multiple other social and evolutionary psychologists, how our ability to operate at the individual consciousness level and the group consciousness level gave rise to the concept of religion. So as soon as people started organizing themselves in groups enough that they did, what's the word for like a religious ceremony?
Rituals.
Ritual, thank you, that's
Yeah.
it. Once they started doing rituals like dancing around a fire or making vocal noises together synchronistically, they started to experience group consciousness. And he gives some modern examples of that. One of them was the founder of a major tech company who described how he had a spiritual awakening and experienced group consciousness for the first time at a rave. How he walked into a rave and everybody was doing the same thing and dancing together, and there was a DJ at the front orchestrating it, and his consciousness ceased to be individual, and it was
That's funny you said that because
group.
that's exactly where my head went when you were saying that. I thought of like a concert and people
Yeah.
feeling like they're like part of the thing when they're at a concert. Because
Right.
that's something you hear people say a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I thought to metal shows and hardcore shows because
Yeah.
they not only do they have like an established culture, but they do something together where they're all doing the same thing. And if you're not familiar with it and you walk in, you don't understand what they're doing, which is really valuable because that means
Yeah.
all those people have an inside joke. They have not an inside
Yeah.
joke, but
Yeah.
an inside culture. They
Yeah.
know how to operate with one another, and that's their group. So
But to the uninitiated, those guys look crazy.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so if you went and you watched and you're like, what the hell's going on? And then someone explained it to you and got you out of your shell and you participated in it, as long as you truly lost yourself in the experience, let go, you might experience what the New Age would call an ego death.
Mm-hmm.
The ceasing individual consciousness and experiencing that you're just part of a group. You
Yeah.
are just the whole group dancing in that moment. So he says that when people developed the ability to experience group consciousness, that was the first time that they realized that they could think about consciousness, and they wouldn't have articulated it this way at the time because we never understand what we're doing until after we do it, evolutionarily speaking. But once they experienced group consciousness and individual consciousness, they started thinking about consciousness beyond just the group consciousness. And they started thinking about even nature operating around them as spirits. So
Yeah.
tribal, if you follow the history of religious ideas, tribal religion considered the spirits of nature around them to be conscious, and but also not to have any specific morals or preferences. So if they went out and on a hunt and they didn't get anything, the spirits didn't just want to give us animals today. You know, the spirits
Yeah.
didn't give us animals today. If they went out and got a hunt, the spirits blessed us today. But they didn't think of those spirits that they were interacting with on a daily basis as having any preferences, as having any personality, as having any ideas that should be followed or anything like that. They were just, hey, you know, the tree gave us apples today, the tree didn't give us apples today.
Yeah.
But they thought of the environment around them as being comprised of living conscious beings.
Sure.
As soon as we stepped into the agricultural phase of our evolution, we started thinking of our deities as having laws and rules because we had to collaborate enough with each other that there were some decisions that we had to make that benefited other people but didn't benefit us. And without that idea, we couldn't cooperate and collaborate as groups. So first we realized that we were a group and we experienced group consciousness. Then we realized there's spirits beyond us. Then, as we gained an ability to collaborate, we met that collaboration with a story about how there's great deities beyond us that have preferences about what we should do, have laws about what we should and shouldn't do, so that we could construct a, and what do you call those structures outside of buildings that people stand on to wash windows? Scaffolding, yeah, to create a moral scaffolding together that we would all have to buy into, pitch in on, and commit to so that we could work together.
Yeah.
Well, as soon as different groups start doing that, they're going to develop in slightly different ways, just like living animals develop in slightly different ways based on their environment. And so at that point, now that we've established a tribe and invented or discovered, depending on your religious beliefs, deities that are advanced enough to have preferences for us that we express loyalty to, now when another tribe comes along and has a different deity that they also are loyal to and that they also believe is sovereign, you're going to get some messiness at that point. So that that train of thought is going to lead to the division in the political sphere today. So I'm going to set that aside for now.
Okay.
And here's something else I'm excited to tell you about. So Jonathan Haidt's talking about how research conducted in the Western world is not reasonably encompassing of global human values. It's only, our research only describes the morality of people in the Western world. And he describes people in the Western world as weird. And weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And all of those traits of Western culture are strange or miraculous, depending on your perspective, but they're distinct. You know, regardless of your perspective, they're distinct.
Yeah.
If you think it's a good thing, you know, then it's a miracle that we developed this and the rest of the world hasn't. If you're critical of Western culture, you might say, well, that's really strange that we developed that way.
Sure.
But the fact that we are a weird culture has some implications about the moral matrix that we live in. Jonathan Haidt doesn't go into how we developed into that strange Western matrix, but another book that I'm reading that you're about to start reading as well, something we're going to be presenting soon, is Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas.
Yep.
Richard Tarnas is the founder of a graduate program at the California Institute of Integrated Studies in California, super woke university. The graduate program he founded is called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. And
cool.
In addition to being a scholar of astrology, he is a scholar of the development of the Western world, and he wrote a really, really well-respected book called The Passion of the Western Mind. So one of the stories that Richard Tarnas tells at the beginning of Cosmos and Psyche is the pros and cons of the overly scientific and secular worldview of Western culture and why we developed it. And it's really convenient that I ended up reading that at this time because it helps me understand how we became weird in the first place. So the Copernican revolution was defined by the moment that we realized the Earth is not the center of the universe. The Earth being the center of the universe was such a fundamental idea that was so tangled up in our religious beliefs and so deeply confirmed by our intuition that it was a massive ego death for humanity to realize that the Earth was not the center of the universe. If you look back on what religious people, for example, were saying during the Copernican revolution, even Luther, who was the progressive Christian theologian of the time, was saying, how can you put the discoveries of science over the revelations of the Holy Spirit? Luther was like a radical conservative when the Copernican revolution came about.
Interesting.
Because everybody was just like, what the fuck are we supposed to do with this?
Yeah.
The Earth isn't the center of what? From that point forward, we realized that we could use the scientific method to discover things about the universe that absolutely blow our mind. The pro of that is best articulated by Steven Pinker in Enlightenment Now, where he describes how all of the scientific discoveries and advancements that have been made by the Western world are lifting the entire planet out of poverty and disease. So there's an amazing side to that we realized this is a world, this is a universe of objects. It can be studied, we can hypothesize about it, we can research it, we can observe things about it, we can understand it, and we can just blow our own minds with this process.
Yeah.
So we started
There are
doing
rules that we can discover.
Hmm?
There are rules, and we can figure out what they are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's rules, and we don't know them yet.
Yeah.
But we know enough rules to know that we can figure out the rest of them.
Right.
Holy fuck, we're
Right.
conscious. So that's the pro. The con is that we became obsessed with viewing the world as objects, which has created a psychological phenomenon where we think of ourselves as being extremely separate. So we don't just think of the world as being a place of objects. We think of ourselves as being objects in that world.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've lost that archaic wisdom that we're all interconnected in some way.
Yeah.
And so we've created secular liberal societies that view all of us as being separate objects that so now something to say real quick about seeing the world as objects. This is something that Jordan Peterson talks about in his textbook Maps of Meaning. There's two ways to view the world: a forum for action and a place of things. What is here and what should I do? Forum for action, what should I do? Seeing the world in that way, that's the religious sphere.
Mm-hmm.
The world is a place of things. What is it comprised of? That's the scientific sphere.
Mm-hmm.
The Western world, after the Copernican revolution, strayed to the left and went too far into, too far, who's to say? We went far.
Yeah.
We went far into the secular worldview where we think the world is a place of things and we're just things in that world.
Yeah.
And so we lost that concept.
Very materialistic.
Yes,
Yeah.
extremely materialistic, and that's the core idea of the weirdness of the Western world.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're Western, now we're educated, we know we can share ideas. Now we're industrialized, we know we can build things that serve us. Now we're rich because capitalism is building wealth, and now we're democratic because we realize, oh, we don't just have to compete with each other until one guy makes it to the top and
Yep.
then kill him when we disagree with him. We can decide ahead of time in a collaborative effort to anoint one person
Yeah.
as the top of the dominance hierarchy. So what our condition is unique. And the reason it's important to understand that is that if you understand that, then you understand there's more than just that. So understanding what characterizes the Western ideological matrix means that you've broken that matrix. And you now understand that the whole world doesn't operate that way.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole other ideological space out there in which it's understood that the world is deeply interconnected and interwoven.
Mm-hmm.
And people are less likely to industrialize so radically that they harm the environment because they think of themselves intuitively as being connected with that environment. They don't think of trees as something that you just cut down. They think of trees in more of the avatar sense, blue people avatar, not bending avatar.
Mm-hmm.
That avatar sense, this is all interconnected. We're all one thing. The world is this great spirit in which we are a cell.
Yeah.
So that's something to understand about Western culture. Now, let's see where I want to hop next. Yeah, let's get into the categories of morality that
Cool.
Haidt describes and his evolutionary explanations for them.
Do it.
Unless you have any comments or questions about.
No.
Cool. So he admits that these are guesses that he has confirmed with research, which is a great thing for him to admit because he's modeling the idea that he expressed at the beginning of this book, that we make decisions or discoveries by intuition, and then we confirm them with logic after the fact. So he models that really well and
Right.
says,
That's cool.
my guess about the moral space is that they can be summarized in these 5 different moral categories, and based on my research and my collaborations with other social psychologists, there's data to back up the fact that these 5 morals are innate.
Yeah. Hypothesis seems to hold up.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he's a really, really detail-oriented scientist. When you read the book, man, he'll tell you one idea, and then he'll tell you 10 studies that back it up, and then he'll tell you a story that helps you understand it, and it's so worth reading. One distinction that he makes about innateness is that a lot of social psychologists or evolutionary biologists think of innateness as something that is innate to all people. And he says that that's fallacious. That's the word, right? It's a
I
fallacy.
think so. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sounds right.
Pharisaical. It's that.
That thing.
So saying that something is only innate if it's innate to all people is like saying that something's only innate if it's innate to all living beings. because there's evolutionary diversity among humans. Humans grew in different directions for different reasons.
Yeah.
Some evolutionists will say that's not innate because look, we found a tribe in the Amazon that doesn't do that. It's not innate. They don't have it.
Right.
And that's the wrong way to understand innateness. What's innate in one tribe is not innate in another tribe. Tribes have grown different moral structures.
Yeah.
But he believes that these 5 are extremely fundamental, especially to weird cultures, because that's the matrix that Jonathan Haidt's operating in.
Okay.
He doesn't go into why the Eastern world is different than the Western world. The most fundamental category, what we talked about a couple weeks ago when we did the first half of this book, is care and harm. Something interesting to understand about care and harm is that reptiles, as in the pre-mammal species, is playing a very low risk, low reward numbers game with their offspring. So they'll just pop out a bunch and hope a couple of them make it.
Yeah.
Mammals,
Like turtles on the beach. Well, that's not a reptile, but like that.
yes,
Yeah.
that's the example that came to mind for me too. And
Yeah.
I don't know what a turtle is. Amphibian?
Yeah.
A
Or-
fish.
No.
I think fish.
No, it's Wait.
Shellfish. Yeah, they're a shellfish.
now I'm tripping. Are they a reptile?
I don't know. I don't
A
care. I
sea
didn't read a book about
turtle-
turtles.
It must be a reptile. Yeah, that's a reptile.
Jamie,
Is that a reptile?
It's amphibian.
amphibian.
A sea turtle?
It goes in the water. Amphibious.
So do I.
Yeah. But they're supposed to go on land too.
I don't know.
It's amphibian, but Evan's going to confirm.
Turtle?
So,
Like a sea turtle.
yeah, because we're talking about the ones that pop out.
Reptiles.
Reptile. Okay.
Reptile.
All right. We got it then.
Wow.
Wow.
Crikey. So humans, or not humans, actually, yeah, humans, traded physical power for brain, right?
Mhm.
So we developed bigger heads and smaller bodies. If you go back in our evolutionary history, developing bigger heads lines up with making higher risk, higher reward bets on our offspring. Part of the reason is that when we started giving birth to offspring that had bigger heads, it became more damaging to the female reproductive system to give birth.
Right.
And so
Yeah.
that required more cooperation. So our ability to trade body size for head size made birth more painful, more difficult, more medically dangerous, required more cooperation. Females in our species actually started to need help to give birth. And we started to, man, I can't remember why this part happened. I bet I can just find it real quick. We started to change from giving birth to offspring that were immediately capable of surviving to giving birth to offspring that weren't capable of surviving yet. So if you think about it, the infant is really in the womb for the first 6 months that it's out of the womb. It's still attached to the mother.
Sure.
Biologically speaking, it's still feeding off of the mother. It still can't do anything.
Yeah.
It's not a sea turtle. It doesn't pop out of its mom and run across the beach.
Yeah.
So, and let me find real quick why that part happened, because I thought that was pretty interesting.
That what you're saying also makes me think of like the Garden of Eden story, like when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then
And now childbirth is
now it's going to
painful.
hurt a lot.
Yep.
Yeah.
That biblical idea, mythologically speaking, is absolutely dead on with the evolutionary story, which is
Yeah.
the right way to think about biblical theology. Think about it as metaphor that describes the purpose and meaning behind what evolutionary biologists can describe the details to. That's
Sure.
exactly the right way to think about a biblical story. And
At least
so
that one.
I'm saying in general,
Yeah.
another book to look up, Genesis Enigma, takes 7 sections out of the Genesis creation story and then describes how they are symbolic of the eras of evolution that have been described by scientists.
That was like the one where it went like day by day, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, for example, they describe when the Genesis story describes that animals exploded into the sea all of a sudden created by God, and that was before the land animals were created. And if you look into the evolutionary story that scientists are constructing,
Yeah.
they're still struggling to explain how quickly animals evolved in the water. I can't remember what the name of that kind of gap or evolutionary mystery is,
I know what you're talking about.
but it's
yeah.
like the explosion of the sea mystery or whatever the hell.
Cambrian? Cambrian.
The Cambrian explosion.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So evolutionary biologists are still trying to describe the Cambrian explosion.
Right.
All of a sudden there was just shit in the ocean, and then later there was shit on the land.
Yeah.
And the Bible said, so the Bible is not the evolutionary story, because as Western scientists, we want to pick apart all the details.
Yeah.
But that's the right way to think of the story. It's symbolic. It's a general overview of something that took millions of years to happen.
Yeah.
Because people looked deeply enough into their intuition that they saw the evolutionary story unfold,
Mhm.
and they told that story to attach us to our evolutionary reality. And
Sure.
and exactly when we developed consciousness, that's when childbirth became painful. God made childbirth painful because we developed consciousness. In the scientific story, nature made childbirth painful because we developed greater intelligence. That's the same exact
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
So let me just read through this paragraph. Mammals make fewer bets and invest a lot more in each one, so mammals face the challenge of caring for and nurturing their children for a long time. Primate moms place even fewer bets and invest still more in each one. And human babies, whose brains are so enormous that a child must be pushed out through the birth canal a year before he or she can walk, are bets so huge that a woman can't even put her chips on the table by herself. She needs help in the last months of pregnancy, help to deliver the baby, help to feed and care for the child for years after the birth. Given this big wager, there's an enormous adaptive challenge to care for the vulnerable and expensive child, keep it safe, keep it alive, keep it from harm. So that's why I can remember. Haidt doesn't describe the evolutionary explanation for why the bigger head means that we had to give birth to the baby before it could survive on its own. I don't understand that part of the story exactly. But the great point here is that we started making bigger bets on individual beings. They were more intelligent. That made childbirth more complicated. That required more cooperation within the tribe. And something that I would add on to it, this is just my own bullshit, so take it or leave it, is that making greater and higher risk bets on children meant that we invested more into each child. So instead of just popping out offspring and then letting them go do their thing,
Right.
now we have one, and we invested so much into this one offspring that we want to teach it everything that we know. And I
Yeah.
think that would make ideas evolve more quickly. Because if every parent taught their child everything that they knew,
Yeah.
we would evolve more quickly. So
Sure.
I think that's part of it too, but that's just a story I made up that hasn't been researched. So now, next category, morality, loyalty, and betrayal. So we talked about how tribes started to organize themselves around core ideas that gave them the ability to cooperate.
Mhm.
And with that development, we developed the idea of loyalty. Because once you belonged to a group, think about it this way. If you go to a rave on Saturday,
Yeah.
and you go to a hardcore show on Friday, and you 100% dress the part and talk the part at both events, some people will call you something.
A poser. Yeah.
They'll call you something. There's still this idea that we have that if you're going to do both of these things, you're betraying one or the other. If you dressed like yourself, that was a little bit rocky and a little bit ravey at both, people might give you more of a pass. But we still have that intuitive feeling that if you cooperate in two different tribes, there's something about you that's untrustworthy.
Yeah. Well, because it's like you're hedging your bets. Like you've got bets on two different things. You've got
Right.
an investment in two different tribes or two different cultures, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
If you were doing that back in the day when tribes were so competitive with each other that tribal competition was genuinely life and death,
Yeah.
then you'd be causing a big issue. You would be betraying the core gods of each tribe, and this is to skip ahead to category number 5, it would violate the sanctity foundational value, because you could spread diseases between tribes. And they would think of you as dirty for having affiliated with another tribe. And they
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to articulate that that's because you might have gotten a virus from them. They might have a more spiritual terminology for it,
Mhm.
but it's a real concern that different tribes have adapted immune systems with different strengths and weaknesses. So
I imagine part of that would be like that because this other tribe has a different sort of religion or a different sort of set of faith, that naturally people start thinking that any other faith is of the devil, or
right.
anything outside of their religion is anti their religion, and therefore they could be getting some sort
Right.
of dark entities or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there is something true about it, and there is something wrong about it.
Mm-hmm.
It was true that they could go get an infection or disease. It was true that they could ideologically pollute that tribe with an idea that didn't work well enough into its worldview to be adaptive. And if you
Right.
introduce the wrong piece of ideology into a tribe that's not ready for it, it might
Yeah.
crash their moral system. And
Totally.
and so there's something deeply true about it. But now you see, like, it's a lot of kids will grow up in Christian homes, and then so, like, there's this chick, Dylan, I met her at New Vintage. She has a little brother who's like all into Eastern philosophy and Alan Watts.
Cool.
And this is probably a kid who felt like his ideological needs or psychological needs weren't being met by his religious community and needed to look elsewhere. There's a lot of Christians who would look at that and say, you're betraying your tribe, and you're doing something that's of the devil. But the devil just means anything that's bad, according to the moral matrix I live in.
Yeah.
And Buddhism is bad according to the moral matrix I live in, so Buddhism is of the devil.
Yeah.
They don't really have any reason to believe that Buddhist doctrines line up with Luciferian doctrines as defined by the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Sure.
So there's no rational argument behind it, but other, bad, devil, other, devil. It's all
Right.
blended together in the fundamentalist psyche. So I think something that's good about that is that you realize that you need to shop for another moral matrix at precisely the point that you no longer need the moral scaffolding that exists in the community that you live in. Because it's not a good idea to go into a Christian church and start telling kids, hey, get out of this church and go study Buddhism. That's a bad idea. Leave them alone.
Yeah.
If they realize that they understand the world in a way that is not being articulated or described by the religious community they live in,
Yeah.
they will independently decide to go shopping elsewhere.
Yeah.
You know, don't take a 2-month-old and throw it in a pool. When the baby is confident enough to explore, it can go out and confront danger. It still might get hurt, but you should let people explore when they feel confident enough to explore and take that risk.
Mhm.
A year-old baby, obviously, you should still put a fence around your pool, so it's not a perfect example. But don't try to force people out of their religious matrix. Leave them alone. If they want to look elsewhere, they'll look elsewhere, and when they're mature enough to do
Yeah.
that, they will. But if people say, no, Christianity is what I need, I could never go anywhere except for C3, New Vintage is of the devil because they have too many lights, Bethel's of the devil because they're too big,
Yeah.
because they're a little bigger than us, and whatever. Okay, man, I'm going to just leave you alone and leave you in your moral matrix because you're obviously there for a reason,
Yeah.
So our fundamental loyalty and betrayal instinct came from our commitment to the cooperative units that made our evolution possible as groups. And another interesting
Yeah.
point on the intuition side of thinking through these issues is that Dante articulated the lowest level of heaven as being reserved for the betrayer.
Yeah.
So that intuition, Dante is not describing what's evolutionarily valid. Dante is describing what's deeply intuitively felt. The betrayer is
Yeah.
at the bottom of hell. And that's something that human beings feel too. You're
Yeah.
a fucking poser. You don't belong here, whatever it is. So that's how deep that intuition goes. So another one is fairness and cheating. So there's a social psychologist called Trivers or Trivers. Never heard it said out loud, but he had a theory of reciprocal altruism. So when you put human beings in controlled studies where they're each given money and they take turns, and on your turn you can share money with other people and give it away, or you can keep it. If they know who's giving away money and who's not, the participants in the controlled study will give more money to the people who have offered more to others. So there's this natural function that we have. That's one of the ways that he explores whether there's data to back what he intuitively sees in the evolutionary story. Let's do a controlled study and see how people do act.
Yeah.
People give more to people who are more generous. So here's another example. If you're more conservatively oriented and you see somebody on the street asking for money, you might think, well, based on my understanding of the fairness principle or my understanding of reciprocal altruism, what are you giving to society so that I should stop and give you something? But if you see somebody in a work uniform in a company pickup truck at the gas station who says, dude, could you cover me on gas? You know, I get paid in a couple days. Like, fuck. You're going to, if you're more conservative oriented, you'll give money to that person, but not the person on the streets. And here's another example, actually. I was working on an electrical box for the city this week. And after I was done working, I walked across the street to a taco truck. They had seen me working across the street. I gave them my debit card, and it got declined. And they said, and they said, no problem, just come in and pay for it another time. And they just handed me the burrito. But they had just seen me doing something that looked industrious and productive right across the street.
Yeah.
If I had walked up in dirty clothes and a beard that hadn't been cared for, and I stunk and all those things, they might recognize that because I wasn't contributing, because their immediate observations of me didn't indicate that I was contributing to society,
Yeah.
they'd be more hesitant to trust that I was going to be able to be reciprocal enough for them to give me the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
But they saw, oh, this guy's chipping in, he's doing something, you know, he's probably good, he'll come back. And they were wrong because I forgot yesterday. But I will, obviously I will.
Yeah.
But I did forget yesterday. So another thing to correct, 2 weeks ago I said one of the base categories of morality was authority and subversion meant submission. Subversion means rebellion. So each of these,
right, yeah.
each of these categories is described by the value and the opposite of that value that you would find abominationismable if you value that value, the opposite of it, the greatest betrayal to that value. So authority and subversion. So if you look at chimp behavior and how they organize themselves into hierarchies, which if you're curious about that, the book to read is Affective Neuroscience by Jacques Panksepp. When chimps organize themselves into dominance hierarchies, one rises to the top, and then everybody says, we're going to follow this one until he does something that demonstrates he's an incompetent leader, and then they overthrow him. How do you decide who rises to the top? Well, the whole point of organizing a group is because a group can more competently combat nature or contend with nature than an individual.
Yeah.
So if you're going to have a leader at the top of that group to organize it better so that it can better contend with nature, who belongs at the top of the group? Whoever's most competent. How do you decide who in the group is most competent?
Whoever's best at interacting with nature.
By competing with one another.
Right, okay.
All three of us are in a group because we're contending with nature. Which one of us should lead? Whoever wins between the three of us, because we're three little cells of nature.
Yeah.
So whichever one of us is better at beating up the other two is obviously contending with nature more competently than the other two, so they rise to the top. But one of the principles of basic leadership, and this is just a side note, I learned this in a lecture about the stoned ape theory. The two major traits that leaders of chimp hierarchies held were courage and compassion. They were courageous enough to get to the top of the dominance hierarchy, and they were compassionate enough to not piss off the tribe so that the tribe would let them stay at the top of the dominance hierarchy.
Right.
And that's part of how some social scientists justify the stoned ape theory, which is that psilocybin mushrooms helped usher us from primate existence to human existence, because two of the traits that people who have used psilocybin mushrooms see an increase in are courage and compassion. So
Sure.
So anyway, that was just a side note, but authority and subversion was necessary for us to be able to organize our groups better and organize our groups by letting the most competent person rise to the top. Now here's something interesting about ancient authority. Ancient texts always describe leaders as being anointed by God. Well, what does that mean? Because that's in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that's in the Hinduist traditions. All of the old ancient religious traditions say leaders are anointed by God. And more fundamentalist conservatives still say that today.
Yeah.
Whoever wins, that's who God chose. We're going to support that person, pray for that person, hope that they succeed. Well, we just described how competence in contending with nature allows you to rise to the top of the dominance hierarchy. Well, what is God in the matrix of evolution? Nature, that which selects. If you're an evolutionary biologist, then your concept of God ought to be that which selects. So when two beings compete with each other and one of them wins, who decided who won?
Nature.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
they would say either nobody decided, it's just random, but, well, it's not completely random because there's enough of a structure that they're competing within that one of them won. If one of them won, then there's a game. And what's the evolutionary name for that game? It's nature. So that's what evolutionary biologists call God, nature. So nature selects people so that they get better at interacting with each other, and then nature selects groups, and then nature selects between groups, and nature selects the leaders within the groups, because whoever best contends with God or contends with nature rises to the top of the dominance hierarchy.
Yeah.
What does Israel mean?
I don't know.
Wrestle with God.
Okay.
So whoever wrestles with God the best, Israel's the chosen land. So there's some symbolism there. They're the chosen land, and they're called those who wrestle with God. Whoever wrestles with God contends with nature. That's the same statement.
Yep.
The best rises to the top of the dominance hierarchy.
Yeah.
So that is an explanation for the intuitive or religious view that leaders are selected by God. They wrestle with God the best. They contend with nature the best. Nature prefers them. There's a few ways to articulate that same core idea.
Yeah.
But that's our base understanding of the authority principle. And rebellion is viewed by some people as horrible because without a leader in charge, the group will disintegrate. And when the group disintegrates, we'll slide backwards on our evolutionary journey. But rebellion or subversion is viewed as honorable by some because if you go to that ancient primate principle, someone gets to the top of the dominance hierarchy and that shouldn't be there. What the other chimps should do is select him right out of office.
Yeah.
Because they're nature too.
Yeah.
So you've got the left of the political sphere that's more rebellious and the right of the political sphere that's more optimistic about leadership. The fifth category of morality described by Haidt is sanctity. We talked about sanctity a little bit on the last episode. We talked about the omnivore's dilemma. Being omnivores, we can eat meat or we can eat plants.
Wait, so what's the opposite of sanctity?
Degradation.
Okay.
Degrading something.
Okay.
So if I bit my finger off right now, even though there's nothing morally wrong about that according to the Care Harm Foundation because I didn't harm anybody else, I just made my own decision. And according to weird culture, you can make whatever decision you want. You're an autonomous being on a consciousness island.
Yeah.
If you want to bite your own finger off, that's none of anybody's business.
Right.
But if you believe that there's something sacred about the human body, you believe I've degraded something sacred by biting my finger off, you would view it as disgusting and you would view it as morally wrong.
Yeah.
So it's sanctity versus degradation. We talked briefly on the last episode covering this book about how the sanctity principle came from the omnivore's dilemma, which is that we can eat meat or we can eat plants or seeds or beans or roots or leaves or all sorts of shit. So drop us anywhere on the planet, we're going to fucking find something to eat besides the middle of the desert. But we have so many choices as to what we should eat that we need an extremely active disgust reaction. So when a deer looks at one berry and says, I shouldn't eat that, and looks at another berry and says, this is good, I should eat that, they probably aren't consciously aware that the reason they shouldn't eat that is that it's poisonous.
Right.
And that poison is a chemical that's not compatible with their biology, so that it blah, blah, blah. I can't even articulate it. I'm a human being in 2020. But they know that's good, that's bad.
Yeah.
Yum. That's what they have.
Yeah.
That is yum. So that's what the disgust reaction is for. So we already talked about that one on the last episode. And we also talked about how I think it's interesting that we still consider things to be unclean, that we don't yet know why is unclean. One of those being the concept of the soul. So if you ask atheists whether they're willing to sell their soul for $2, and you include on the contract that it's a psychological experiment and a non-binding contract, 80% will refuse. So they don't believe in the soul, but they believe that the soul is sacred enough that they shouldn't sell it for $2, even if the contract says it doesn't mean anything.
It's funny that when they did this test, nobody was even willing to do a test without putting that restriction on there for risk of there actually being consequences of it.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Even the scientists couldn't do that.
Exactly.
It actually would have been a more interesting experiment if they would have left off that part.
Absolutely.
but that's risky. We don't actually know.
Yeah,
Maybe that would do
and
something.
whatever organizations decide whether your study is ethical enough that you're allowed to do it would probably say you have no idea what you're fucking with. So another
Yeah.
example of that, there was a social scientist doing experiments with dimethyltryptamine, DMT,
Mm-hmm.
the active ingredient in ayahuasca. A lot of people have common experiences when they're under the influence of DMT,
Yeah.
where they describe a similar area that they found themselves in, that they felt that they were at,
Yeah.
describe a similar set of beings that they interact with. So
Mm-hmm.
the social psychologist was like, are human consciousnesses going the same place when they do the same drug? So he started doing these experiments, started injecting people with DMT to keep them in the trip longer so he could study the alternate dimension he thought their consciousness might be getting taken to. And then he said, I can't do this anymore because I don't know the implications of this for people's souls.
Yeah. I think this was Terrence McKenna that did that.
Thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
Terrence McKenna. So you don't think so, you know so. So
I'm 90%
okay.
sure. Yeah.
I think he's where I learned the stoned ape theory thing from too.
Yeah. Actually, that might have been his brother, Dennis. Dennis McKenna is also
Interesting.
involved in that. Yeah.
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So even though social psychologists or social scientists in general will sometimes study phenomena that pertain to the soul or the spirit, they practice ethical boundaries around those because we don't know what it is, but we know it matters. So that's kind of like a deer knowing that it shouldn't eat that,
Yeah.
but not knowing why it matters. They don't know if they'd get hurt if they eat it, but they know that they shouldn't.
Mhm.
So we still have some views that are intuitive, but not yet logically understood. There's a lot of data that you can read about the evidence for the afterlife. Life After Life by Dr. Raymond Moody is a great one. Journey of Souls by Dr. Michael Newton is a great one. You can read data collected by scientists about reincarnation, about the afterlife, about your experience after you die. We're getting into that realm, but we're not there yet. And so we just are careful, but we only let our intuition guide us. There's no data to guide us.
Yeah.
Who cares if you sell your soul? That doesn't mean anything, or we don't know if it means anything yet.
Yeah. We don't know.
So we're still in an awkward space with that.
Yeah.
I wrote down a page number on this bullet point, and I don't know why. So let's go to that page and see what's there.
Fun.
Oh, it's just a cool quote by it's an essay by a philosopher. Repugnance, here as elsewhere, revolts against the excesses of human willfulness, warning us not to transgress what is unspeakably profound. Indeed, in this age in which everything is held to be permissible so long as it is freely done, in which our given human nature no longer commands respect, in which our bodies are regarded as mere instruments of our autonomous rational wills, repugnance may be the only voice left that speaks up to defend the central core of our humanity. Shallow are the souls that have forgotten how to shudder. So that's a description of the utility of degradation. And he's arguing that degradation is the last thing, the last string keeping us to our connection to the sacred.
Interesting. Yeah.
Time to get into politics.
Let's do it.
Let's offend somebody. I left it for last because, and so did Jonathan Haidt. He talks about the yin and yang. That's why I found this book, right? Because I wanted to hear someone articulate the yin and yang of liberalism and conservatism and how they can work together instead of see each other as enemies.
Right.
He articulated it in the very last chapter because he wanted to give all of this foundation. Let's break your matrix first and say, let's look at your morality and the morality of others from a bird's eye view.
He could have lost someone. If it would have been chapter one, he would have lost a bunch of people.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My homie, John Roach, I just ran into John Roach the other day, which is so cool because I've been talking about him and thinking about him a lot. He was like, I've thought about you every day this week. I was like, I've thought about you every day this week. We ran into each other at a gas station. And
That's like exactly what we were talking about on the last, or I guess the second to last episode, the reality of ESP. That like when you're doing that sort of thing, it's because there's some sort of psychic like you're aware of like
there's a
what's
deep
coming.
subconscious future prediction.
Yeah. And so you guys
Or-
were like maybe at some level both kind of aware of what was coming.
Yeah, and at another level of analysis, seeing reality from another abstract level of analysis, it's a synchronicity. And I was reading about synchronicity in Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas that day. Like right before I met up with him, I was reading about synchronicity
Yeah.
and how Carl Jung used synchronicity as a principle, as a kind of guru tactic to break secular minds of patients that he was serving to get them open to thinking about things that they couldn't think about.
Mm-hmm.
So one example real quick, because it's juicy. A girl that he was, a lady that was one of his clinical clients, had a dream about a beetle, scarab,
Scarab beetle.
scarab, thank you.
Yeah.
She had a dream about a scarab beetle. This lady was she was like the condescending, I know everything, secular liberal, everything's materialistic, everything's in categories, there's nothing beyond, like dead soul kind of lady, right?
Yeah.
He's trying to get her to think about things in a new way. She just doesn't want to think about things in a new way. She doesn't embrace the intuition. She doesn't embrace the mystery, and he was trying to get that to break. She had a dream about a scarab pendant
Okay.
that was on a necklace in a dream that she had. Jung is sitting there listening to her tell the story. He hears a click on the window. He walks over to the window and opens the window. A scarab beetle flies in the window. He snatches it out of the air,
What?
walks over to her and says, "Here's your scarab." And from that point forward, they were able to make clinical progress. So that's a guru principle, using the magic of the world to break somebody's mind enough that they're willing to think about things in a new way, and you can actually teach them.
So, did Jung summon it? Or did
No.
he just know that it was
he
coming?
believed in synchronicity, and he engaged with synchronicity. He believed that the universe is ordered enough that if a scarab pendant appeared in her dream and showed up at the window, that was a normal occurrence because the universe is ordered. So he would interpret dreams and interpret real life experiences in a more similar way than Freud would, because he believed that dreams were a place that you went where something happened, and the waking world is a place that you went where something happened. He viewed them as more different experiences of reality. So something happened in a dream, and then it happens just like, oh, I ran into that person 10 times last month. What the hell? You know,
Yeah.
he didn't see a boundary between synchronistic events in dreams and reality. And so the event didn't surprise him. And
Wow.
he leveraged synchronicity to demonstrate to her that the universe was more ordered than she could possibly comprehend, and therefore there are things that exist that she can't comprehend, and therefore it was worthwhile to learn new ideas.
Yeah.
So that's one way to justify the utility of the miracles performed by Jesus and the great gurus of history. They used miracles to get people to think in a new way. So, oh, you think you understand the world, huh? Here's your scarab. You don't. Now, let me tell you, you can't talk to your husband like this every night, you know?
Yeah.
That you realize, oh, I have something to learn.
Yeah.
And that's you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. It's funny, I'm trying to remember the quote, so I'm trying to say it in all biblical language. I don't fucking remember the direct quote. But Jesus said, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven unless you become like a child.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an example of that right there. That woman couldn't progress psychologically until her mind was blown the way that a child's mind is blown every
Right.
day. Because
Right.
a child leaves the house and they go, what the fuck is a Wendy's? You know?
Yeah.
And their mind's getting blown all the time. They're learning every day. Their
Yeah.
worldview shatters every day. If you live that way as an adult, you enter the kingdom of heaven. Life becomes a playground of mystery. So, all that to avoid talking about politics.
But I wanted to say synchronicities, like in so much of the books that we've been reading, you can't get away from synchronicities being like a topic in it. Like
Right.
in American Cosmic, it was very much a topic. In Reality VSP, it's very much a topic. And I'm reading Invisible College now, which is another UFO book, and they
Mhm.
talk about synchronicities a lot.
Right.
It's a
Right.
fascinating thing. It's got a lot of different implications.
There was a scholar of Jung who said that the task of future Jungians who want to bring the ideology, not even ideology, but bring the ideas, it's not an ideology, and I'm actually about to define ideology in a minute, bring Jung's ideas forward need to study and understand and articulate the implications of synchronicity. That's what you need to do if you want to carry the Jungian legacy forward. And one of the things that Richard Tarnas talks about in the beginning of Cosmos and Psyche is that one of the ways to shatter the weird ideological matrix that we live in the Western world is to help people understand that the universe is ordered enough that synchronicities occur, and you are therefore experiencing a relationship with reality, which is a really advanced way to articulate the idea that modern American Christians dumbed down. You have a relationship with God. It's not about religion. It's about having a relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you realize that you're in a relationship with reality, it won't surprise you when synchronicities occur because you understand that reality is alive, creative, and intelligent,
Yeah.
as are you.
Mm-hmm.
And you affect reality, and reality affects you. And when you're seeing, the fact that your eyeballs can perceive that object is the reason that it's there, which I don't know how to explain because I don't know anything about that new body of physics every New Age person's talking about. What is that?
New
New Age body of physics.
No, that new body
quantum
of
physics?
Yes, quantum physics.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't understand quantum physics. I can't
No,
tell
me
you why
either.
the object's only there because it's being observed, but it is. But you're also only observing it. What is it? The object's only there because you're observing it, so therefore you are putting the object there. But the fact that there's anything there to observe in the first place is the only reason that your consciousness is really validated. So I think I'm
Yeah.
butchering that. Alan Watts says it a lot better. But if you realize that reality is happening to you and you're happening to reality, then you're in a relationship with God. You're in a relationship with being. You realize that being is happening to you. You're not just being in a universe of dead things. And so that's why synchronicity is so important, I think, to the Jungian worldview, is that Freud was studying the world as a place of things. If you understand the world as a form for action and a place of things and a place with a substructure of creative intelligence, synchronicities are normal. If I say I love you yesterday and today, that's not going to surprise you because you know I'm creative and intelligent and I have character and personality. And so I did the same thing twice. So if you understand reality is alive, it won't surprise you when it does something twice.
Yeah.
You know, that can shatter that weird matrix that's killing souls right now. So all that to avoid talking about politics. Here's a definition of morals. Moral systems are interlocking sets of values, virtues, norms, practices, identities, institutions, technologies, and evolved psychological mechanisms that work together to suppress or regulate self-interest and make cooperative societies possible. So if we cut out all the categories and recap, moral systems are interlocking sets of values that make cooperative societies possible. And
Okay.
that is Jonathan Haidt's definition. He wrote that. That's his subjective definition of morality. Then his definition of ideology. So that's interesting, right? So the relationship between morality and ideology is that morality is an interlocking set of values that makes cooperation possible. It becomes an ideology when you decide that that truth is the absolute truth and you're committed to living within the matrix of that moral structure. That's an ideology. So if you're so committed to your political or religious worldview that you wouldn't consider another, you don't just have a moral system, you have an ideology.
Like, so it's like well, it's like a moral system, but that it doesn't, well, I'll just let you read it. I'll let you read the definition.
You know, I wanted to, but I must have written down the wrong page. I wrote down 322 for the definition of ideology.
So an ideology is
It's
like
not here.
a moral system that becomes, like, the values become more important than what they're serving. Like, it's no longer about making your society function better. It's just about this is what it is, and whatever society builds around this is what it is.
I didn't hear the second part because I was flipping
No
through
worries.
pages, but not necessarily do ideologies stop serving the purpose of moral systems. The difference between moral systems and ideologies is like the difference between thinking that red is a color and thinking that red is the color. I understand my hoodie's pink, but I also understand that there's other colors. So that's the equivalent of having morality, but not ideology. I get that your shirt's black, my hoodie's pink, and those are both colors, and those are both clothing. I don't just think hoodies are pink because mine's pink. That would be an ideological attachment to my pink hoodie. So even though
Okay.
it's an ideology, it can still serve you, right? So we were talking about how people
How could that serve anything?
because people here's another I'll hop to that in a sec. So we talked a few minutes ago about how people who are in a religious matrix shouldn't necessarily break that matrix. They should stay there until they're prepared to independently make the decision to wander out of their matrix and confront the world of chaos and look elsewhere as well. Until the point that they're prepared for that, they should stay in their ideology.
Okay.
It's still serving them. It still serves the purpose.
Okay.
The purpose of the ideology of the fundamental Christian community is to organize a group of people around a shared value system that allows them all to cooperate with each other better. So people who subscribe to a religious system are more likely to give to charity than people who aren't.
Okay.
And they're more likely to give generously to other people who also belong to their moral matrix. So that's one example of how the ideology is making them better people, and especially to the people that should matter most to them. So that's good for them. It's not just a moral structure, it's also an ideological structure because they think it's the only way to live.
Okay.
But it still serves them, it still benefits them.
Okay.
That's so funny, I wrote down the wrong part. So we'll skip ahead.
So who are you voting for?
Trump. Stories.
Wasn't really.
Okay, so there's two fundamental stories that Haidt paste in here that describe what he says are the fundamental stories of liberalism, the fundamental story of liberalism and the fundamental story of conservatism. As soon as you commit to a moral structure or an ideological body, as human beings and storytellers, we tell a story about how we got where we're at that backs our ideology. So he puts in here what he believes are good examples of the core liberal story and the core conservative story, and it's pretty cool.
Cool.
And where's the liberal one comes from? Comes from a social psychologist named Smith. Surprise, surprise. Good name. The liberal progress narrative. So I think he was intentionally describing the narrative of the liberal worldview. Once upon a time, the vast majority of human persons suffered in societies and social institutions that were unjust, unhealthy, repressive, and oppressive. These traditional societies were reprehensible because of their deep-rooted inequality, exploitation, and irrational traditionalism. But the noble human aspiration for autonomy, equality, and prosperity, I mean, you see that theme autonomy right there, that's the Western culture's moral crux, we're autonomous.
Yeah.
And we're interacting with a world of things. Equality, prosperity, let me go back. But the noble human aspiration for autonomy, equality, and prosperity struggled mightily against the forces of misery and oppression, and eventually succeeded in establishing modern, liberal, democratic, capitalist welfare societies. While modern, I don't know what a welfare society means exactly. It doesn't mean the derogatory conservative perspective on the welfare system, but something like societies that consciously decide to take care of each other.
Yeah.
While modern social conditions hold the potential to maximize the individual freedom and pleasure of all, read that one again. While modern social conditions hold the potential to maximize the individual freedom and pleasure for all, there is much work to be done to dismantle the powerful vestiges of inequality, exploitation, and repression. This struggle for the good society in which individuals are equal and free to pursue their self-defined happiness is the one mission truly worth dedicating one's life to achieving. So
Wow.
So the liberal story is about there have been tyrannical powers that we have had to struggle against to establish this freedom and make things more fair for everybody.
Yeah.
Which is it's a great narrative. It's a great story. It's a great narrative. Everything about it is true.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the fundamental conservative story is taken straight from a Reagan speech.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry. Not a Reagan speech, but I'll just read it real quick. The clinical psychologist Drew Weston is another master of narrative analysis. In his book, The Political Brain, he extracts the master narrative that was implicit and sometimes explicit in the major speeches of Ronald Reagan. Here's the story. Once upon a time, America was a shining beacon. Then liberals came along and erected an enormous federal bureaucracy that handcuffed the invisible hand of the free market. They subverted our traditional American values and opposed God and faith at every step of the way. Instead of requiring that people work for a living, they siphoned money from hardworking Americans and gave it to Cadillac-driving drug addicts and welfare queens. That's obviously racist. Instead of punishing criminals, they tried to understand them. Instead of worrying about the victims of crime, they worried about the rights of criminals. Instead of adhering to traditional American values of family fidelity and personal responsibility, they preached promiscuity, premarital sex, and the gay lifestyle. And they encouraged a feminist agenda that undermined traditional family roles. Instead of projecting strength to those who would do evil around the world, they cut military budgets, disrespected our soldiers in uniform, burned our flag, and chose negotiation and multilateralism. Then Americans decided to take their country back from those who sought to undermine it. So is that not our dad's story in a nutshell?
Yeah, yeah. Those are really interesting, those stories, because like you can totally see where both of them are coming from.
Yeah.
But I wish the conservative one got a little bit mean by the end of it. It felt like.
Yeah, but I
Yeah.
think that's accurate. I think
Yeah.
that is accurate. I think that or at least I think it's generally accurate. It seems like the left has embraced aggression a little more recently
Mhm.
than they're fundamentally known for doing. But
Sure.
but generally, the conservatives are more aggressive and hateful and more. They have a greater threat sensitivity, biologically speaking. People who identify themselves as conservative have the genetic trait of sensitivity to threat stronger than people who identify as liberals. And so they're more likely to identify an antagonist and point at that antagonist. So they are more hateful, aggressive, and pointed in their opinions.
Sure.
So I think it is fair for the conservative narrative to be meaner. I do think they are meaner.
Yeah, yeah.
And the reason they're meaner is because they're more aware of the fact that threats exist. And so a centrist might say, oh, threats exist, but that is a threat, that isn't. The liberal might be more naive. Oh, threats generally don't exist. Oh, there's no conspiracies going on. People aren't that bad. And the conservatives are more like, there's threats everywhere and also racist things, And so they fall on different sides of that. After describing those fundamental narratives, Haidt describes a couple arguments for each worldview.
Mhm.
Now, here's something though to understand about conservatism and liberalism, and this is something that's gonna offend liberals potentially, and I'll try to do it as tactfully as possible. Jonathan Haidt he's a liberal voting person. He has tried to do consultation work with Democratic campaigns and Democratic institutions to help them understand why it is that they win less elections than conservatives. And
Is that true?
it's true right now. It's the Senate and the House
Oh, okay.
and the president are all Republican, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Sounds
so
right.
yeah, they're all majority Republican. Well, obviously the White House is 100% Republican. We'll see what happens in November. Maybe a fucking blue wave. Who knows? But right now, Republicans are winning more, and at whatever time he was talking, they were. So the point is, he was going to Democrats and saying, "Hey, I've been trying to figure out why we're losing elections, and here's one of my ideas. I'm a moral psychologist. This is what I've learned about liberals and conservatives, and this is what I think is a conservative advantage that we need to understand." They did studies with, it was like 130,000 people. The people who did the surveys identified whether they considered themselves liberal or conservative, and then they rated moral dilemmas and took sides on moral dilemmas and rated how bad or how good moral dilemmas were. And Haidt used this research to articulate which of the 5 moral categories were emphasized by liberals and which by conservatives. And what he found was that liberals primarily operated on care harm and fairness cheating. They want things to be caring and they want things to be fair. The conservatives are almost perfectly balanced on all 5. So
Interesting.
conservatives have a more well-rounded moral worldview. And in the interest of tactfulness, I'll say Biden did something in the debate last night. The 3rd presidential debate happened last night. He did something that I thought was so intelligent, which was multiple times he emphasized that he wants to be the president of the United States, not the president of the Democrats. And when Trump identified states as being blue, he said they're not blue and red states, they're American states. Thought that was really, really smart. And and it's because he's trying to now be elected by the general public. He's not going for a Democratic nomination. He's going for votes from the American people.
Yeah.
And so he should look at that loyalty and betrayal trait and try to encourage American loyalty and appeal to that moral category as well, which I thought was super smart. Generally, liberals emphasize care, harm, and fairness cheating way above the other three, and a lot of liberals will even say that the Sanctity Foundation and the Authority Foundation are immoral, and they don't understand how they're fundamental to human evolution, how the idea of sanctity and how the idea of authority are fundamental to the function of society.
True.
And they might be, I generally consider myself a liberal. I'm voting for Trump this election because as a liberal, my job as a liberal and the way I'm oriented is to question tyrannical power. I'm an idea-oriented person, and so what I'm concerned about is ideological tyranny. And so when gay people were like, "Hey, we want to get married," and Republicans were like, "No, that goes against our religious system," I was like, "Fuck you, leave them alone. What the fuck are you talking about? Keep your ideas to yourself." And now the liberals are like, everybody who disagrees with us is racist. And so I'm like, "Fuck you, keep your ideas to yourself." And so I've fallen more Republican because of that liberal orientation within me, that orientation to challenge power. And so I happen to be voting that way, but the liberal and conservative positions are fundamental beyond party politics. So there's a lot of liberals in my position right now who are like, "Oh crap, my urge is to question tyrannical power, and I feel like you guys are being kind of bullying with your ideas and kind of patronizing and condescending to people who disagree. So now I want to put like my own party in check." And so so I just want to say that I'm not trying to present one side better than the other. I consider myself a liberal, but anyway, going into his argument for liberalism, his main argument for liberalism is the regulation of power. So his first argument is that the government can and should regulate superorganisms and economic superorganisms. So when companies like Amazon get so powerful that they can just do what they want, or Disney or World Banks, the government can and should put them in check and limit their power. Like Jesse Ventura says there should be a maximum wage. That's not exactly the same thing, but that's the liberal function, is to say, no, you can only get so big, you don't get to just play God. That should be the liberal function. And another great argument for liberalism, fundamentally speaking, is regulation. So you see liberals calling for regulation, you see conservatives calling out regulation. The EPA can make rules that make the world better, and they fucking should. I'm taking I work in the heating and air industry. I'm taking classes right now through Sheet Metal Union 55 local, and I'm learning right now about how chlorine atoms harm the ozone layer, because you need to know that on a basic level. You need to know that chemistry if you're going to be working with chemicals, because it's obvious scientific truth. The one chlorine molecule can destroy 100,000 ozone molecules.
Whoa.
And so the EPA has said, no, don't use that substance, use this one. Yeah, it's a little more expensive and it doesn't destroy the environment. You fucking idiots, use this. That's what liberals do. Conservatives don't do that. So that's an absolutely essential function of liberalism. Then he breaks conservatism. This is him describing the yin and yang here now. He breaks conservatism into two categories because of the fact that they are more morally complex than liberals. They're more morally well-rounded than liberals. He breaks them into libertarianism and social conservatism. So the core truth of libertarianism is that markets are magical. And if you want to understand how markets are magical, read Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, who describes like 100 different categories of human welfare that have improved radically since industrialization. Obviously, when you let people compete and let them keep what they earn and give them the freedom to do what they want to do, explore their own creative ideas, not do things that are just approved by a government body, give people that freedom, that's natural. That's nature manifesting in economics. And when you do that, absolutely miraculous things happen. The whole world is getting lifted out of poverty right now because of free market capitalism and the advancements that have come out of free market capitalism. So the fundamental libertarian idea is markets do magic. The fundamental social conservative idea is that we should preserve our power structures. And so this is about a loyalty to the loyalty principle and a loyalty to the authority principle. Loyalty and authority are the backbone of us even being a cooperative group, let
Sure.
alone a society, even a cooperative group of primates.
Okay. Yeah.
Loyalty and authority are fundamental. We
Yeah.
need to respect our power structures. We need to maintain them. And so the liberals will say, if you get too tyrannical, we're going to tear you down, which they should. And the conservatives will say, we should keep our power structures intact at all costs, which they should.
Mhm.
So I want to sum up this book by talking about the UFC.
Okay.
Martial arts has gotten more effective because multiple separate bodies of martial arts have tried to kill each other.
Yeah.
Now martial arts is way better.
Yeah.
If you put a fucking UFC fighter who has studied Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, and Judo and American boxing against a wrestler from the 40s,
Mhm.
it's going to be like a gun against a knife.
Yeah.
But they've tried to kill each other. When those martial arts came together in UFC 1 and decided that they were going to see which one was the best,
Yeah.
there was fundamentalists in each martial art that said, no, this is our way of life, and we don't want to lose this. We want to pretend that Aikido is real. And if you grab somebody's finger, they'll do a front flip. Don't question our way of life. This is our tradition. And so everybody came together, and we created something that was better.
Yeah.
The Eastern way of seeing things is that when two forces oppose each other, they're cooperative. The Western view of seeing things is that when two things oppose each other, one of them's going to die and one of them's going to survive. And whichever one that I'm in is the one that needs to survive and the other one needs to die.
Mhm.
The problem with that worldview is that we're not all on the same fucking one. So if I'm voting for somebody and you're voting for somebody else, and we both live in that weird Western matrix where we think that competition means death to somebody,
Mhm.
then we kind of secretly want to kill each other. And you really do see an unbelievable level of, what's like the opposite of politeness? What's that like?
Rudeness.
No. Yeah, that is the opposite of politeness. Yeah.
Abrasiveness.
No, it's the word for like having a bad intention towards somebody, like actually malicious. Yeah, thank you, malice. Evan said malice. Unbelievably malicious attitudes between some conservatives and liberals, and they really want the other team to die. Like you can look up news correspondents who work on the left-leaning media and who are saying Republicans should be wiped off the face of the earth, and vice versa. They're both like, oh, kill them. That's the Western understanding.
Yeah.
Well, there's something really good about that, right? If Conor McGregor trains to his best and Khabib trains to his best and they go out and fight, we're going to see the best fight that we've ever had. This is amazing. These are the people at the top of their game.
Yeah.
When Pacquiao fights Mayweather, we all buy a ticket because we're watching the two people who are best at it try to kill each other. But
Yeah.
when you see a really, really good fight, I wish I knew their names. There's a UFC fight last week that was like this. The guys hugged, kissed each other on the cheek, bowed on with their faces to the mats at each other after they fought because they had a fucking slugfest for 3 rounds.
I've seen Stylebender do that kind of bow. I don't
Yeah,
know if that
but-
was
but-
it him or
No, this was one where they were both like that. Stylebender will generally do that. Israel Adesanya, my favorite fighter, shout out to him. But these two fighters were both, they had a lot of tension going into the ring. It was one of the fights where there was a beef built up.
Really?
But they were so well matched and so brutal that at the end they were just celebrating. They were as affectionate. They're more affectionate than I would be with you as my brother.
Wow.
They were hugging each other, kissing each other on the head, grabbing each other's faces like this, 2 inches away from each other's face. They got on the ground. They both bowed all the way down.
Wow.
They went in trying to kill each other, but at the end they both realized that they both became better fighters because of the other person, and they each owed it to the other person that they rose to their greatest potential. And I
Yeah.
felt that in battle rap too. When we had a really, really, really good battle, we would both dap up at the end and be like, you brought out the best in me, and the other dude would be like, you brought out the best in me. And there was something about that bond that was different. So that's something good for people in the Western world like us to understand. Yes, conservatives and liberals are trying to kill each other. Liberals are trying to convince people to think liberally, and they're trying to convince people that conservatives are dumb and wrong.
Mhm.
Conservatives are trying to convince people to think conservatively and convince people that liberals are dumb and wrong. That's what they should do. But if we can see far enough into the future and see wisely enough to understand that ultimately that competition is going to give birth to a worldview that's better than either of the ones competing,
Mhm.
we might have some hope of having a country for the next generation of people.
Yeah. That'd be good.
And that's all I got.
Dope.
Got
Night school?
anything? Evan, you got anything?
No.
Cool. Night school.
Night school.
Jonathan Haidt, Righteous Mind.